The morning sun broke over the horizon, casting golden light over the sprawling fields of Sarah Lewis' family farm in rural Nebraska. The land stretched out in every direction, dotted with crops, livestock, and the old farmhouse where she lived with her grandfather, Harold. The farm had been in their family for generations, passed down from one stubborn Lewis to the next. Sarah, a 16-year-old with a deep love for the earth, spent most of her days helping her grandfather with the fields and caring for their small herd of cattle. She had learned the art of farming before she could even walk, and now, as a young woman, she took pride in the life they built, the quiet beauty of the land, the rhythm of the seasons, and the simplicity of their life had always seemed to shield her from the outside world. But today, everything would change. Sarah was in the middle of gathering eggs from the chicken coop when the sky above her began to hum. At first, it was a low, distant sound, almost like the rumble of thunder on a summer evening. But there was something off about it, an unnatural quality. She paused, looking up, trying to find the source. Her grandfather, who had been on the porch, squinted at the sky. "Sarah, you see that?" he called, his voice sharp with concern. Above them, a massive shadow darkened the sky, blocking out the sun. Several sleek, dark shapes appeared to be descending rapidly from the heavens. Sarah felt her heart skip a beat as she watched the objects grow larger, their metallic surfaces gleaming like alien beacons. Her grandfather reached for his binoculars, the familiarity of the action giving him a false sense of calm. "Those aren't any aircraft I've ever seen," he muttered. The figures in the sky were far too large to be anything from Earth. They looked like spaceships, cruel, jagged crafts, hovering in a perfect formation as they cut through the clouds. The ground beneath their feet rumbled, the air growing thick with an oppressive weight. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "Grandpa, what's happening?" she whispered, stepping back from the coop, her gaze fixed on the descending ships. Harold didn't answer immediately. His weathered face was pale, eyes locked on the strange craft above. There was an old memory stirring in his mind, one from his military days, of stories about alien encounters and the possibility of extraterrestrial threats. But this was no drill. This was real. He grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her inside the farmhouse, his voice barely above a whisper. "Get to the cellar." Now. Outside, the ships began to land. The ground shook violently as the first alien craft touched down in a nearby field, its landing gear sinking into the earth with a thunderous crash. Sarah stumbled backward into the farmhouse as her grandfather slammed the door shut behind them, locking it with trembling hands. Through the windows, they could see the strange silhouettes of the alien ships, each one massive enough to blot out the sky, casting long, dark shadows over the land. A strange hum filled the air, like an electric buzz that seemed to vibrate in Sarah's bones. Her grandfather quickly moved to the small radio on the kitchen counter, turning the dial frantically. Static filled the room, then a voice, a frantic, disjointed broadcast from the local news station. "We have confirmed multiple alien craft have landed in several locations across the country. Authorities are urging everyone to stay indoors and avoid confrontation." The transmission was abruptly cut off, replaced by the screech of static. Sarah felt her heart pound in her chest. "Grandpa, what's happening? Are they attacking?" Harold didn't respond immediately. Instead, he moved to the back of the house, grabbing his old military rifle from a closet. The rifle, a relic of his service, was heavy and cold in his hands. He checked the ammunition, then tossed Sarah a worried glance. "I don't know," he muttered, voice tense, "but we need to be ready." Before Sarah could ask more, the air outside filled with the eerie sound of alien engines, low, humming roars that echoed across the fields. Then came the footsteps, heavy, mechanical, like the sound of enormous metal legs crunching over dirt and grass. Sarah's stomach twisted with dread. She stepped closer to the window, peering out through the curtains. The alien soldiers were unlike anything she had ever imagined. Tall and imposing, They wore sleek, dark exoskeletons that seemed to shimmer with a strange energy. Their faces were hidden behind black helmets, and their bodies were armored from head to toe. As they moved, they walked in perfect synchronization, each step purposeful and calculated. They began to spread out across the farm, moving methodically toward the house. Sarah could hear the soft chatter of their language, an odd mixture of clicks and growls, like insects speaking through a filter. A few of the soldiers raised strange-looking weapons, scanning the surroundings. Their leader, a tall figure, distinguished by a series of jagged metal plates on his armor, raised his hand, signaling for the others to stop. "Stay down," Harold whispered, lowering Sarah behind the counter. He pressed the rifle into her hands. "If they get close, we'll have to fight." Sarah's fingers trembled around the cold metal of the rifle. She had never fired a weapon in her life. The idea of killing anyone, let alone alien invaders, was a thought she could hardly comprehend. But the air around her was charged with tension, and she could feel her grandfather's fear. Their world, the quiet life she'd known, was about to be shattered. Through the window, the aliens began to set up a perimeter around the house, their movements growing more deliberate, more ominous. They were here to stay. As the aliens closed in on the farmhouse, Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. The sound of their heavy boots crunching across the earth was deafening, a rhythmic march that seemed to shake the very soil beneath her feet. The sun, which had been shining just moments before, was now eclipsed by the alien ships hovering ominously above the fields. The air was thick with a strange energy, the kind that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. Her grandfather's hands were shaking as he checked the rifle once more. "They're getting closer," he muttered, his voice tight with fear. "We need to be ready, Sarah." Sarah nodded, clutching the rifle with sweaty palms, though doubt gnawed at her insides. She wasn't trained for this. She had no idea how to fight these invaders, let alone defend her home. The only thing she knew was the land, the farm, the animals, the earth itself. But now, even the soil seemed to pulse with something ancient, something alive. A low rumble shook the farmhouse. At first, Sarah thought it was just another tremor from the ship's landing. But this one felt different, deeper, like the earth itself was awakening. She glanced out the window, her breath catching in her throat. The ground beneath the aliens' feet had begun to shift, as if something was stirring beneath the surface. The invaders didn't seem to notice at first, too focused on securing the area. But Sarah could feel it now. It wasn't just a tremor. It was a pulse, a heartbeat that thrummed through the earth. Then it happened. From the cracked ground, a massive shape emerged, tearing through the dirt like a living mountain. A dragon. Its scales were an iridescent green, glimmering in the dim light as it unfurled its enormous wings, creating gusts of wind that sent the alien soldiers scrambling for cover. It roared, an earth-shaking sound that rattled the windows and sent shockwaves through the air. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. The dragon's eyes locked onto hers, and for a brief, surreal moment, it felt as though time itself had stopped. The creature's ancient gaze was full of wisdom, power, and something else. Familiarity. A second dragon emerged, this one with scales of fiery red, its wings spreading wide, as it too let out a mighty roar that echoed across the fields. The dragons were emerging, one after the other, their massive forms shaking the earth as they rose from the soil like ancient titans. There were so many of them, huge, majestic creatures that could easily dwarf the alien invaders. Each one carried an aura of primal power, like they were born from the very land itself. "Grandpa, what's happening?" Sarah breathed, barely able to take her eyes off the dragons. Harold stood frozen, his mouth agape. His face was pale, but there was something else there, a flicker of recognition. "The legends, they're real," he whispered, almost to himself. Sarah didn't understand, but she didn't need to. The dragons had come, and they were here for a reason. With one last look at her grandfather, Sarah stepped out onto the porch, her heart beating in her chest like a drum. She raised her hands, calling to the dragons with a quiet but commanding voice. "Come to me," she whispered. In an instant, the dragons turned, acknowledging her command. And with that, the battle for Earth had begun. The moment Sarah raised her hands, the air seemed to crackle with power. The dragons, each one a force of nature in its own right, responded to her call with an intensity that could not be denied. They soared into the sky, their enormous wings beating the air like thunderclaps, shaking the ground with each mighty beat. The sunlight was blotted out as their massive forms blocked the horizon. A primal roar echoed from the red-scaled dragon, Zephyros, as it took to the skies, its flames lighting up the alien vessels as it ascended. The invaders were stunned, paralyzed in shock as they watched the dragons circle overhead. Commander Torek, standing at the forefront of the Kalor soldiers, stared in disbelief at the giant creatures that had emerged from the earth. He had expected resistance, but nothing like this. Nothing even close. The soldiers hesitated, unsure of how to respond to such a threat. "Open fire. Eliminate the creatures." Torek's voice was harsh, filled with both awe and fury. The Kalor forces, though armed with advanced weapons, had no idea how to fight something so primal, so deeply tied to the very fabric of the planet they sought to conquer. They raised their energy rifles, firing energy blasts at the dragons, but the beams bounced harmlessly off their thick, shimmering scales. The dragons swooped down, agile and fast, dodging the alien fire with ease. One by one, the Kalar's weapons sparked and sputtered as they tried to engage, their high-tech plasma rifles completely ineffective. Then, without warning, Zephyros opened its jaws, unleashing a torrent of searing flame. The fire crashed down onto the ground, engulfing an entire squad of Kalor soldiers in a blaze of blue and orange. The soldiers' shrieks were drowned out by the crackling of the fire, and what remained of their weapons was melted to slag. The ground was scorched black, a reminder of the raw power these creatures commanded. The other dragons joined in, tearing through the ranks of the invaders with ease. One dragon, a massive golden beast named Korin, swung its tail like a whip, knocking several alien soldiers through the air. The impact sent shockwaves through their ranks, sending them tumbling across the fields like ragdolls. Another dragon, a silver-scaled creature named Ishtara, dove down with incredible speed, sinking its claws into the hull of an alien transport ship, sending it crashing into the earth with a thunderous explosion. The Kalor forces attempted to regroup, but the dragons were relentless. They were everywhere at once, flames, claws, and wings tearing through the alien invaders. Their advanced technology was no match for the raw might of Earth's ancient protectors. Each dragon was a living weapon, an unstoppable force, and they seemed to know exactly where to strike. As their foes scattered in disarray, Sarah stood at the edge of the porch, her heart racing as the dragons fought on her behalf. "Hold the line, don't let them escape." Torek barked, his voice filled with venom. But it was clear that his forces were no match for the fury of Earth's ancient guardians. The Kalar were losing, and they were losing fast. The dragons had arrived, and they were not leaving until the invaders were nothing but a distant memory. Despite the sheer power of the dragons, the Kalar were not so easily defeated. As their soldiers scattered and their weapons proved useless, Commander Torek grew more desperate. From the command ship above, he unleashed a powerful energy cannon aimed directly at the battlefield, hoping to turn the tide in his favor. The cannon, a massive weapon capable of eradicating entire cities, hummed to life, its deadly beam charging in the skies above the farm. Sarah's eyes locked onto the weapon as it charged up. A deep, unsettling dread filled her chest. The weapon's energy was unlike anything she had ever felt before, dark and unnatural, like it was pulling the life from the earth itself. The cannon fired with a burst of blinding light, and the beam arced down toward the ground, the sky splitting with its intensity. It struck the earth with a deafening crack, sending a shockwave that rattled the farmhouse and knocked Sarah off her feet. For a split second, everything went dark. The world was a blur of smoke and debris. Then, through the dust, Sarah saw something that made her blood run cold. The ground where the cannon beam had struck was beginning to crack open, the earth itself splitting apart. But just as the beam's devastating effects seemed ready to consume everything in its path, Zephyros, the largest of the dragons, was there, plunging down from the sky in a blur of golden scales. With an earth-shattering roar, it soared straight into the energy beam's path. The dragon's wings spread wide, and for a brief moment, time seemed to stand still. Zephyros' massive form was bathed in the beam's harsh light as the energy collided with the dragon's shimmering scales. The beam twisted and warped, bouncing off the dragon like water splashing against a rock. The force of the blast knocked Zephyros back, but the dragon didn't falter. With a roar of defiance, it flapped its wings, creating a shockwave that sent the blast scattering harmlessly into the sky. The energy that had once seemed so unstoppable was now a mere flicker in the distance. Thorak watched, eyes wide with disbelief. The energy cannon was destroyed. Its power drained as the dragon absorbed its force and released it back into the atmosphere. A moment of stunned silence passed before Zephyros, with Sarah watching from below, let out a mighty roar. The sound was deafening, louder than any weapon, more primal than anything the invaders had ever encountered. Sarah's heart surged with hope. The dragons, the protectors of the earth, were far stronger than the Kalar had anticipated. The invaders' most powerful weapon was useless, and in its place, the dragons stood resolute and unyielding. The battle had shifted. "Keep fighting," Sarah shouted to Zephyros, her voice rising above the chaos. She didn't know if the dragon could hear her in the traditional sense, but somehow it felt like it could. The dragons responded with renewed vigor. Their fierce roars filled the air as they dove into the fray once again, tearing through the alien forces, their flames lighting up the sky. The Kalar were no longer just fighting for dominance. They were fighting for survival. The tide had turned in favor of Earth, and no matter what the invaders threw at them, the dragons were ready to defend the land. Commander Thorak, though stunned by the destruction of his energy cannon, wasn't one to retreat easily. His eyes burned with a mixture of fury and disbelief as he watched his soldiers crumble under the wrath of the dragons. The battlefield was chaos. His forces were scattered, their once organized ranks reduced to a shambles by the dragons' relentless assault. But Thorak wasn't finished yet. He had one final strategy, one last move to make, and he would see it through to the end. "Bring in the reinforcements," he growled to his tactical officer, his voice low and dangerous. The officer hesitated, glancing at the carnage around them, but Thorak's icy glare left no room for doubt. The officer nodded, tapping a series of commands into his wrist console. Above them, more Kalar ships began to descend from the sky, huge vessels bristling with weapons and armored soldiers. The reinforcements were massive, far greater in number and firepower than the initial wave. Sarah stood with her grandfather at the edge of the farmhouse, her heart racing as the new fleet appeared overhead. It was clear the Kalar were far from surrendering, but something inside her stirred. She wasn't just watching a battle unfold, she was part of it, and she could feel a connection to the dragons. It was as if their power, their ancient spirit, flowed through her veins, and the ground beneath her feet was alive with energy. She turned to her grandfather. "Grandpa, there's something I need to tell you." Harold's face was pale, his eyes tired, but he nodded as though he had known this moment would come. "I think I know what you're about to say." Sarah swallowed, trying to steady herself. The dragons, they're not just animals. They're part of something much bigger, something ancient. Harold's gaze grew distant, as if recalling a memory from long ago. "The legends," he muttered, mostly to himself. "I thought they were just stories." Sarah stepped forward, her eyes locked onto the approaching alien ships. "They were never just stories, Grandpa. They were warnings. The dragons are Earth's guardians, born from the very core of the planet. They've been waiting for this moment, waiting for someone to awaken them." The ground trembled again, and Sarah could feel the dragon's presence more than ever now. It was like an ancient song had begun to play, and she was the one who could hear it. She could hear their voices in her mind, the deep rumble of their thoughts echoing like thunder through the air. Before she could speak further, one of the larger dragons, Ishtara, landed beside her. Its massive form dwarfed the farmhouse, its silver scales glittering like the moon. Sarah stepped forward, placing a hand on its scaled neck. The connection was immediate, like a rush of energy that flowed through her entire body. "We have to end this now," she whispered. Ishtara's eyes glowed brightly in response, as though understanding her words. The dragon let out a low growl, its body vibrating with power. As Sarah stood there, her connection to the dragons deepening with every passing second, she knew what needed to be done. The Kalar would not stop until Earth was theirs, but Earth had its own power, and it was ready to fight back. The dragons were not just protectors, they were Earth's last line of defense, and with Sarah as their guide, they would not fail. With a command from Sarah, the dragons prepared for one final, cataclysmic clash. The tide of the battle was about to shift once again. As Sarah stood before Ishtara, the silver-scaled dragon's deep, resonating growl seemed to shake the air around her. Her fingers tightened around the dragon's thick scales, and in that instant, a surge of understanding washed over her. It wasn't just that the dragons were Earth's protectors. They were a part of the planet's very soul, intertwined with the land, the sky, and everything that lived within it. They had been slumbering for eons, waiting for the right moment to awaken. That moment had come. The Kalor reinforcements continued to descend, their ships filling the sky like a swarm of locusts. Torak, watching from his command ship, had no idea what he was about to face. He had underestimated the power of Earth's ancient guardians. And now, with Sarah leading the charge, the dragons would make him pay for his arrogance. "Prepare for the final assault," Sarah shouted, her voice carrying across the battlefield. The dragons roared in unison, an ear-splitting sound that rattled the very air. It was as if the earth itself was answering their call, the land stirring in anticipation. Ishtara raised her head high, her wings unfurling to their full span. The other dragons followed suit, their massive forms filling the sky, each one a living embodiment of elemental fury. The Kalor forces, though armed with advanced weaponry, were about to face something far beyond their comprehension. The dragons were not simply creatures of fire or flight. They were embodiments of Earth's primal forces, bound by ancient magic that the invaders could not even begin to understand. As the first Kalor ship moved into range, Zephyros, the largest dragon, swooped down like a comet, its golden scales gleaming in the sunlight. It opened its mouth wide and unleashed a torrent of flames that engulfed the ship in an instant. The alien vessel exploded, sending a shockwave through the air that knocked several other ships off course. The remaining Kalor forces responded in kind, launching energy blasts from their ships in an attempt to retaliate. But the dragons were too quick, too agile. They darted through the air like living storm clouds, avoiding the blasts with ease. Each dragon was a weapon of unimaginable power, their breath capable of melting through the toughest armor, their claws able to tear through steel like paper. Torak watched in disbelief as his forces crumbled under the onslaught. The dragons were unstoppable, but his pride would not allow him to concede defeat. Not yet. "Send in the dreadnought," he commanded, his voice cold and firm. From behind a line of Kalor ships, a massive warship emerged, larger than anything the aliens had deployed so far. It was an armored fortress, bristling with energy cannons, shields, and weaponry designed to strike fear into any opponent. The dreadnought was their last hope, a symbol of Kalar might, and Torak was determined to crush the dragons once and for all. But Sarah wasn't afraid. She felt the dragon's presence inside her, a deep, unwavering connection. With a fierce, determined glance at Ishtara, she nodded. The time had come for the final clash. The dragons would either defeat the invaders or burn the sky with their fury. "Let's end this," she whispered to the dragon. Ishtara responded with a low, rumbling growl, and together they soared toward the dreadnought, leading the charge in a final, explosive strike that would determine the fate of Earth. The dreadnought loomed ahead, its massive silhouette cutting through the sky like a dark omen. The Kalar had poured all of their remaining resources into this warship, hoping it would be enough to crush Earth's last line of defense. But Sarah and the dragons knew something the invaders didn't. Earth's heart was still beating, and they were its pulse. As the dragons streaked across the sky, their wings beating with thunderous power, Sarah's heart surged with an energy that felt almost cosmic. She wasn't just fighting for survival, she was fighting for the very soul of the planet. The connection between her and the dragons deepened with each passing moment, and she could feel their intent, sharp, focused, determined. Zephyros, the golden dragon, led the charge, his massive wings cutting through the air like a storm. Behind him, the other dragons followed, a swirling mass of fire and fury. With a roar, Zephyros unleashed a torrent of flame at the approaching dreadnought, the flames curling around the ship like a fiery serpent. The ship's shields flared to life, glowing blue as they absorbed the initial impact. But even the most advanced Kalar technology couldn't withstand the sheer power of the dragon's ancient fury for long. The energy began to warp and crack under the assault. The dreadnought retaliated, its energy cannons firing with deadly precision. Blasts of energy erupted from the ship's underside, illuminating the darkening sky with bright, jagged arcs of light. But the dragons were too swift, their movements almost impossible to track. They swerved, dipped, and dodged, evading each strike with ease. Ishtara, with her silver scales glinting in the light, let out a deafening roar and dove toward the ship, her claws outstretched. With a single swipe, she tore through the dreadnought's hull like a hot knife through butter. Sparks and molten metal erupted from the damaged ship. Torek's voice crackled over the intercom, but it was barely audible over the din of battle. "Prepare the final weapon. It's the only way." As Sarah watched the battle unfold, she knew what Torek was referring to. The Kalar's final weapon, an energy bomb designed to annihilate the planet, was housed deep within the dreadnought's core. If they detonated it, it could destroy Earth in a matter of seconds. But Sarah also knew that the dragons would never let that happen. The Earth itself would not allow it. With a flash of gold, Zephyros surged forward, the dragon's immense wings creating a windstorm that threatened to tear the remaining Kalar ships apart. He dove straight toward the dreadnought, his body a streak of flame and fury. As he collided with the ship's exterior, a shockwave rippled outward, tearing apart the ship's defenses and creating an opening in the hull. The dreadnought began to shudder, its power sources destabilizing. Sarah, her mind linked to the dragons, shouted, "Now!" With a final, collective roar, the dragons unleashed everything they had. Fire, energy, and raw, primal magic poured into the dreadnought. The ship's shields shattered, and its interior exploded with a thunderous crash. For a moment, there was nothing but the roar of the wind and the sounds of destruction. And then silence. The dust settled, and Sarah dared to look up. The sky was no longer filled with alien ships. The once feared dreadnought was now nothing but debris, its smoldering remains floating in the atmosphere. The Kalar forces that remained had scattered, retreating into the far reaches of space, defeated. The dragons circled overhead, their roars victorious as they landed gently on the farm. Sarah felt her heart race with triumph as she stood in the midst of the ancient creatures. The battle was won. Earth was safe. Her grandfather, standing beside her, looked up at the dragons with awe and gratitude. "You did it, Sarah. You really did it." Sarah smiled, her eyes shining with pride. "We did it, Grandpa. We all did." And as the dragons returned to the Earth, their slumber once again claiming them, Sarah knew that the planet would always have its guardians. Whenever the call came, they would rise again. Earth was safe, for now. But the bond between her and the dragons would never fade. It was part of the land, part of the earth, and as long as she stood with them, nothing could threaten their world again.